Hey there, students. In this lecture, I'm going to go into a few competing interpretations of the Civil War and what goes into a historical interpretation in general and why that matters. How do we construct historical interpretations and how do they impact how we see things and how should we evaluate how we interpret things such as the Civil War? And what I've titled this lecture is The Confederacy as Other. This may be the first in a number of lectures about interpreting the American Civil War, and if you would like to see me talk about more Civil War stuff, let me know in the comments. But one thing that I've noticed increasingly is an interpretation that has really kind of hit the present when we see the recent removal of Confederate monuments in the city of New Orleans. Now, most recently, the monument to General PGT Beauregard, which was taken down this week earlier, and what prompted me to come up with this lecture. Let me give a quick shout out to all kinds of people on Twitter. Stag High School, of course. They give me mugs, and then Mr. Potter's class, and all of the other great people who have dialogued and trolled with me on Twitter. And so the statue to General Beauregard, what did this statue mean? And, people said it's a war memorial. Others said it's a monument to white supremacy. All right, so what did this statue mean? Now, first of all, this is where we get into historiography, the interpretation of history. And really, I'm going to come at this with kind of an existentialist sort of take here, because what I think here is anytime we reduce actual events to an interpretation, that we are objectifying a subjective past, all right? So the Civil War was fought, we know that, between 1861 and 1865. PGT Beauregard was a general in that Civil War. And beyond that, when we put things together, we come up with an interpretation, but what we're really doing here is objectifying history, and in some ways, history is really kind of dehumanizing the events of the past. And really, as far as this goes, when we interpret the Civil War or anything else, we are putting together a combination of evidence and interpretation. And with this evidence, combined with our interpretation of that evidence, we formulate a historical claim. And the interpretation is often rooted in our own experience and impacts the present. For somebody like me who is, someone with roots in the South, somebody who is white with ancestors who fought for the Confederacy, that may prompt me to look at the Civil War differently and to interpret evidence differently than someone who comes from a much different background. But I think the value here is realizing that people do have different interpretations, and a lot of times those interpretations can even be based upon the same body of evidence. And what I want to do now is examine two competing interpretations of the American Civil War, and there are other interpretations. I'm not going to go into the whole the South was right kind of interpretation, neo-Confederate kind of stuff. That's not what I'm trying to do here at all. What I'm going to focus on here are two interpretations of the Civil War, one which would see the Confederacy as other, and I think this is one of the big prevailing interpretations right now, especially throughout the nation and especially when you get outside the South. Now, the other interpretation I'm going to offer is the Confederacy as American. Now, of course, this is looking at America as a pluralistic society that has lots of different currents of thought. And so let me go ahead and compare the interpretation that looks at the Confederacy as other and another one which would look at it as American. So first of all, when we look at the causes of the Civil War, the Confederacy as other, slavery, and nothing else. The Confederacy as American, slavery, and other things, that this was a complex war with a variety of causes. Now, the Confederates, were racist. Okay, how do we interpret this racism? Now, the Confederacy's other interpretation would argue that the South was uniquely racist, whereas if you're looking at the Confederacy as American, you're looking at this as a regional expression of American racism, which is a nationwide phenomenon with a particular expression in the American South. Now, why did the states secede, and was that legal? There are some, those who would argue the Confederacy as other, that would say that secession was treasonous. Now, if you're looking at the Confederacy as an American movement, I'm going to go with the term not illegal. Again, my purpose in going over this is not to defend secession, but to note that the people who seceded from the Union, they believed that what they were doing was not prohibited by the Constitution. And in fact, the Constitution is silent on this. And of course, you've got the 10th Amendment. Again, I may examine these interpretations further in another video, but this is something that I think is important, that if you look at the Confederacy at secession as treasonous, what is your evidence for that? What do you base that assumption upon? And, is this based on evidence, or is this just something that you heard or read on Google or something like that and just came to that conclusion, and you're promoting that? Now, as far as institutions of the Confederacy, now, some people may look at the Confederate institutions as innovative. The Confederates are unique in a sense because, this is the government that defended slavery, and that the Confederate defense of slavery is really, this is just something unique, it's innovative. Now also you could look at the Confederacy as derivative, that while the Confederates may have been a little more forthright in their interpretations of race, were they pretty much defending interpretations of race that were prevalent in the United States as a whole at the time? Now, for a frame of reference, you might look, at what happened following Reconstruction. Is racism primarily a Southern thing, or is it a national phenomenon? Now, the motivation of the Confederacy, and specifically the Confederate veteran, because note, I think there's a difference between removing a monument to President Jefferson Davis in the city of New Orleans and then removing monuments to PGT Beauregard, Robert E. Lee, people who fought in the war and did nothing to bring about secession or the Confederate States of America. Now, if you look at the Confederacy as American, you might say that these soldiers were motivated primarily by the defense of their homes rather than the defense of the institution of slavery. Let me just go on an aside real quick and say that I'm not promoting an either-or interpretation, because part of what I'm getting at here is that when we interpret complex historical events, that a lot of times it's not as easy as buying one interpretation hook, line, and sinker, that there are a variety of interpretations, and sometimes we may merge these interpretations based on the evidence that we run into. Now, what about emancipation? Emancipation, if someone sees the Confederacy as other, the Confederacy is defending slavery, the Union is fighting slavery, the Union fought a moral war, and the emancipation of African Americans during this war was idealistic. Whereas the Confederacy as American interpretation would say that emancipation was pragmatic, that this was not the first emancipation of slaves by one side in a war of the other side, okay, that this happened before, that pretty much, you go after the other side's property, you hit them where it hurts. So was emancipation idealistic or pragmatic? And then, was the Civil War, as we call it, a war against the un-American? Was it America versus the other? Or was it a war between Americans? These two interpretations really, for me, are, really the two most, mainstream and legitimate interpretations of the Civil War, although I'm open to other people defending other interpretations as well. And so, as far as that goes, if we look at someone like Teddy Roosevelt, now, someone who was the president was from the state of New York, but also had a mother who was from the South. And as president, when he was visiting the South, and of course speaking to a Southern audience, he said, all Americans must ever show high honor to the men of the war between the states, whether they wore the blue or whether they wore the gray, so long as they did their duty as the light was given them. And that's when it comes to Confederate veterans. Should they be honored as American veterans? Or should their memory be dishonored by removing memorials and any kind of reference to them whatsoever, those 250,000 plus Confederate veterans who died in the Civil War? It seemed to me like everyone was so convinced, one way or the other, what the statue of General Beauregard meant. But when it comes down to it, in an existential sense, the statue of General Beauregard is an object. And so as far as its meaning, we'd have to look into that. You have to research that. Why is it that people would have commissioned this statue to honor General Beauregard? And we're talking about something a little deeper than Google. And that is my point, that people, before coming to conclusions about the American Civil War, should really do some of their own research into primary sources and, possibly even read some books on the subject rather than just things that people are writing on the internet. I hope that this was helpful, and I hope that this will motivate some people to do some further study into the American Civil War and reinforce your conclusions with evidence, and evidence that you've sought after yourself and not just what somebody has told you. Let me know what you thought of this. Would you like to hear me talk a little bit more about the American Civil War, or should I stick with other stuff and keep doing my European history thing? Of course, I'm gonna do some U.S. history stuff no matter what. And of course, if you're not subscribed already, do that. TomRichey.net, social media, Instagram, Twitter, and all of that kind of stuff. And I'll be back soon, hopefully to talk some more about the Civil War, but definitely to talk about history. It's always a pleasure.